Hi everyone, my name is Christy Waters and today I'm going to be telling you about a very interesting article that I recently read called Exploring the Relationship Between Fairness and Brain Types in Children with High Functioning Autism Spectrum Disorder. So this was a very recently published study. Autism spectrum disorder is something that I've kind of always been interested in. It's been a big part of my life and my family life growing up, so this is a super cool read for me and I hope that you can learn something today. So an important part when you're considering research and its implications is to understand the context from which you collected the data. And so to do this, we're going to kind of go through some definitions that the researchers presented when they were discussing why their research was important and the background information. So one very important definition is how they define autism spectrum disorder for this study. And the definition they provide us is a very general one. Specifically, they say that autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disorder characterized by impairment in social communication, social interactions, and repetitive behaviors or interests. So this doesn't exclude a lot of people from the study, but it gives them something to work with in who they're going to choose to identify to represent their population of individuals with high functioning autism spectrum disorder. And when I say high functioning, I mean that of all the people characterized with autism spectrum disorder, they're selecting specifically individuals who are verbal. They have a little bit higher, typically developing cognitive and social abilities, but there still is a definite deficiency present. The second thing that's very important for us to define is fairness and how they identify fairness. In our case, we're looking at it through a psychological lens, and therefore we say that fairness is related to pro-social development. It's something that we see kind of universally appearing in individuals around ages 3 and 4, and it deals with how they relate their decision-making in terms of other individuals. And a more clear definition that the researchers give us is that individuals are concerned with their maximum personal development and that of the general public. So when you think about you judging something as fair, you're usually presented with a scenario. You kind of think about the benefit you're receiving from the scenario, the benefit that the other party is receiving from the scenario, and then you compare those things, right? You say who's winning, who's losing, and based on that, you decide whether or not you think the situation is fair. And that's exactly what's happening here. That's a very typical definition of fairness. But most importantly, what our researchers are interested in is how these two variables are related. So previous research has shown that autism spectrum disorder is known to have deficiencies in executive functioning and theory of mind. Executive functioning is a quality of human thought that deals with how we plan and coordinate and execute different things. And people with autism spectrum disorder are known to have very heightened sense of executive functioning. This is great because they can plan things out and execute their tasks very well, but has a bit of a downfall in that they're a little bit more rigid. And typically we see individuals with ASDs not being very flexible. The second aspect of autism spectrum disorder that is known to affect it is the theory of mind. And theory of mind relates an individual's own perceptions of their emotions and how they understand that their mind is separate from another person's mind, and they can kind of analyze emotions from themselves and others and then respond appropriately. So we know from previous studies that individuals with autism spectrum disorders have deficiencies in this. They're not very good at empathizing and understanding other individuals. Previous research has also shown us that the development of fairness is something that is related to also executive functioning and theory of mind. So this study is really cool in that it's relating two different fields of psychology, social psychology and developmental psychology, and showing us that we have these two qualities related in a very similar way, and the researchers are essentially looking for a correlation between these two characteristics. How did the researchers do this? Great question. First, they had to recruit their participants for this study. They did a group comparison method, so that means that they had individuals with autism spectrum disorder that they recruited from a children's medical hospital, and then they also had a second group of typically developing children around the same age from the surrounding community. So we're assuming this kind of gives us the idea that we have similar environmental factors. They come from relatively the same place. Once they had these two groups, participants' demographics, IQ, and diagnoses, if applicable, were assessed, and that gave the researchers a lot more control. They could test these things and see if maybe they were confounding variables of some sort, that they wanted to ensure that demographics, IQ, and ASD diagnosis weren't affecting the variables in ways that were unpredictable. So this was kind of another level of control for them. The researchers then asked participants to do two different things. They assessed their fairness by having them complete this thing called the mini ultimatum game. And then they also did a brain type measure. And this was just another way for the researchers to assess autism spectrum disorder and how it relates to the theory of mind and executive functioning I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on both of these tasks that were completed. The first one is the mini ultimatum game, and this was used to assess fairness. Basically, this was the main task that participants completed. There was a proposer, which was the computer, and participants would go and sit at this computer, and they were presented with 9 different scenarios. These scenarios were 2 different monetary compensations. So the proposer would have a lump sum, and they would say that it would present 2 numbers, one that the computer would keep, in quotation marks, keep, and one that would be given to the participants. And then participants were asked to accept or reject these conditions, and that was seen as their judgment of whether or not the situation was fair. So the 9 different categories presented fell into 3 different categories. Ultra fair, in the first number is what the computer was receiving, and then the second number is what the participant would have received. So in the ultra fair condition, in general, the participant was receiving a lot more money than the computer was. So that was seen as ultra fair, and that it benefited the participant a lot. The fair condition was an even 50-50 split of the monetary sums. And then the unfair condition was that the proposer or the computer would receive more money than the participants would. In addition to completing that task, the brain type was also measured for all of the participants. And the brain type is a model that had previously been published and is pretty well tested by these researchers called Barron and Cohen. So our researchers used this model, and this model basically assesses 2 different qualities: the ability to empathize and the ability to systemize. The ability to empathize relates back to theory of mind and how an individual can identify another person's emotions and then respond appropriately. And systemizing deals with the drive to analyze, construct, and execute plans. So with these 2 qualities, Barron and Cohen came up with 5 different brain types: extreme type E, type B, type S, and extreme type S. And they're all based on the relative ability to empathize and systemize. So the 2 that we're going to talk about is type B. And type B is where we expect most people to fall. Their ability to empathize, their ability to understand and respond to emotions is relatively equal to their ability to systemize and plan and coordinate, etc. The other one that we're concerned with is extreme type S and also a little bit type S. This is where we expect most people with autism spectrum disorder to fall. They are a lot better at systemizing than they are understanding emotions. They can plan and execute a lot better than they can understand and appropriately respond to emotions, which is in correlation with previous research, as we talked about earlier. The results of this study are very cool, but we have to keep in mind the participants that we were analyzing. So the participants in this study, the average age was about 9 years old. It was mostly male, and there were no significant between group differences due to age, gender, or IQ. This is really important because it tells us that the variables we're actually testing aren't related to external things that we can't control, like age, gender, or IQ. And it also tells us who we can generalize these results to, because the only people in this study were children and most of them were male. So we have to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the results of this. The most important result that came out of this study is that high-functioning autism spectrum disorder individuals were more likely to accept unfair offers than typically developing participants. There was a lot of other results that supported this. How did the researchers interpret this data? One of the main things that they talked about was that the results show us that the development of a sense of fairness in high-functioning autism spectrum disorder individuals is far behind that of their typically developing peers. So we said earlier that fairness is something that is a part of normal development, and with autism spectrum disorder and the other complications that accompany it, one of those things is this pro-social developmental quality of fairness. The more unbalanced the development of empathy and systemizing, so during development, when you have greater variation in the amount of empathetic qualities and systematic qualities, you will have a higher degree of acceptance of unpaired preference. So kind of the more extreme of a brain type, the more extreme S brain type or more severe a diagnosis is, the less better people understand fairness and are more likely to pick an unfair preference. And something that's really important to consider is by picking an unfair preference, we know that is something that could kind of bite individuals in the butt, right? When you think about like negotiating salaries and your material well-being, a lot of that has to do with what you perceive as fair and what you're willing to accept. So the fact that we're seeing this can be kind of concerning and shows us that there is a definite need for intervention in people who have autism spectrum disorder but want to live normally in society, which they're very capable of doing. All of this research kind of makes sense in light of what we know about discoveries of theory of mind and executive functioning, and how that relates to development. As we kind of said from the introduction, it isn't anything new. It's just drawing a new correlational research based on, and it supports a lot of previous research. So overall, this study is really cool because it informs our current understanding of the socialization that we see in individuals with autism spectrum disorder, but it can also be used to generate intervention methods and inspire future research, right? With everything we discover, we find a million more questions that we want to answer. So this is really cool that they can kind of pioneer this connection between the social psychology and development of people who have a developmental abnormality, but then there's still a lot more that we need to be done with it. So thank you for listening today. I hope you learned something. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Two important ones being that individuals with autism spectrum disorder show lower empathy scores and higher systemizing scores. That's pretty expected from everything that we already know, but interesting in that it is further supported and it goes back to our main finding. And then another important correlation is that there was a correlation between individuals with autism spectrum disorder having more type S and type ES brains than the typically developing group, and that these individuals did have more acceptance of unfair conditions. So it shows us that with these deficiencies in mind that come with autism spectrum disorder, it means that we are also seeing people experience acceptance of unfair conditions. They don't really understand and predict fairness as well as typically developing groups do.